Hey guys, welcome to the Good Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Watson, and in today's episode, I am speaking with Rich Zimmerman, who is the Executive Director of the Orangutan Outreach, which is a New York-based not-profit organisation which has got a mission to save critically endangered orangutans and protect the rainforest homes. So firstly, Rich, I really appreciate you taking the time out to chat with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Great stuff. So obviously, I've kind of followed your work and your organization for a few years. I think it was, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, I ended up finding about you and felt inspired to adopt one of your orangutans. I think it's Gunung, and
Yep.
he's got one of the cutest little faces, and you can't help but want to, help and support him in some way. But I think his story as well. Could you tell us a little bit about his story?
Gunung is special, and I was checking right before we started speaking, and you started adopting him in 2015.
All right. Okay.
So
Great.
it's been a while, huh? Well, Gunung he's growing up now. He's about I think maybe 6 or 7 years old, or maybe even a little bit older. But he is being cared for in West Borneo or West Kalimantan, at a facility managed by International Animal Rescue in the town of Ketapang. And he's one of about, I'd say maybe 100 or so who are being cared for there now. And he is, like so many others, an orphan, because the forest where he lived with his mother was destroyed to extract timber and be converted into oil palm plantation. And when that happened, the mother was killed, and the baby was grabbed and ostensibly put on into the network of animal smuggling. And he's one of the lucky few that actually got rescued by IAR a few years ago. So he's been going through rehabilitation all these years, and he's getting bigger and learning skills that he'll need to eventually go back into the wild when he's a little bit older. So he's a work in progress, and yes, he's incredibly cute, for a lack of a better word. He has a smile that's gone around the internet millions and millions of times.
Oh, that's really nice to hear a bit more of his backstory. And so, how many, you said there's 100 in that particular place where he's at? How many kind of orangutans are you kind of caring for at the moment?
Gosh, well, we work with a few large partners in Indonesia, in both Borneo and Sumatra, the only two places where orangutans would naturally live in the wild. And you'll sometimes hear me say Borneo, or sometimes I'll say Kalimantan. It's all the island of Borneo, but the Indonesian part of it, which is about 2/3 or 3/4 of it, is called Kalimantan, whereas the Malaysian part is still called Borneo. And then there's a little nation of Brunei tucked in the corner. But our partners are throughout Borneo and Sumatra. So, gosh, between them all, there's probably upwards of 1,000 orangutans being cared for either in the centers proper, or now being looked after in release programs or pre-release programs, depending on the stage they're at, from rescue to rehabilitation to release. And then there's another a fairly large handful, maybe close to about 100, I'd say, who will not be able to be released for either medical reasons, or they've just been in a cage for too long. And so those will they'll never go back into the wild. Instead, they'll be cared for in sanctuary spaces, ideally with no cages, or on islands, or in large compounds that are forested.
Wow, 1,000, that's amazing. And so when did all this come about, and how did you get involved with it?
Strangely enough, I'm entering my 13th year with Orangutan Outreach, which I created in 2007, which was the height of the problems that were starting with the orangutans and the loss of forest due to oil palm. The problem goes back 20 years. I mean, you could argue that problem goes back 50 years with deforestation and logging, but it's really the last 20 years, especially, when instead of just cutting down forests legally or illegally to extract the high value timber, another piece of the puzzle was that after the land was forested, it was burned and then replanted with oil palm seedlings, because palm oil is really a top oil for food products, for cooking, for even for biodiesel. So the last 20 years has seen this rapid conversion, not just for the timber, but to actually then go ahead and destroy the land and use it for oil palm. And this sped up with the 21st century to a point where it was, I think they were saying 6 football fields a minute were being destroyed at one point. And that's just mind blowing to try to get your head around. I mean, 6 football fields a minute, every minute of every day. And the loss of life and the damage it did to local people who were living in these forests, because often it was done to them, not by them. Although, to be fair, some of them did it to themselves, all in the name of profit. So the oil palm itself isn't a new crop. It was imported into Southeast Asia by the British, actually, from West Africa in the colonial era. But it's the realization that this was such a valuable crop, and the ability to then use this land. And essentially there was no pushback. There was no law enforcement to protect the forest, or very little. And so what happened is the animals were basically just emptied out. Local people were emptied out. Animals that were edible, and again, it depends, how you define what you define as edible, were used as such, as meat and protein. And then the illegal smuggling trade of bringing animals out of the forests into the rest of Asia for consumption, or animal products, whether for, so-called ancient medicines, which really, for me, has no validity. But this is what was happening. People just realized you could commodify every single piece of the forest, and it accelerated. And I really learned about it in the beginning, but I didn't do anything, and I wanted to, because I've loved orangutans my entire life. It's just an unconditional love since I'm a child. And I felt, oh my God, I can't, as I learned more about what was happening, I felt like I couldn't not do something. So I began volunteering with existing organizations at the time. This is back in 2005, 2006. And after taking a few trips over, I saw with my own eyes for the first time the results, the forests that were gone. So you're flying over what would have been forest, and it looked, not to make light of it, but it looked like Mordor for anyone who's a fan of Tolkien. It really looked like hell. And then you would go to these rescue centers, the existing ones at the time, and see all of these orangutans shoved into cages, desperate, with their little eyes and their arms reaching, hundreds and hundreds of them, all orphaned, knowing that the mothers had been killed, others, all the male adults had been killed, these great cheek patters, these majestic animals. And so many had not survived. So we were looking at, probably, for every baby we saw, there were probably 9 others that were killed. And I took a few trips and realized I have to do more. And I spoke with more people. This was the beginning of social media and the era of really getting to be able to reach out and talk with people. And so I learned more about the situation and realized that the existing framework of organizations didn't fit my way of thinking. I was coming out of new media, or what was then called new media at the time, in New York, working in communications at UNICEF. So I had a certain way of thinking, maybe the New Yorker my way kind of thing, I don't know. And I realized, okay, the best I can do is sort of chart my own path, work with people who I see are doing amazing work. It just need help from the outside, because my use is not on the inside. My use is on the outside, raising awareness and raising funds. And what I realized is what the orangutans needed was outreach. That was the big buzzword at UNICEF at the time when I was working there in New York. And I'm like, all right, let's orangutan outreach. There we go. So I literally created the organization from the ground up, partnered with, at the time, the Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation, or BOSS, who's still our oldest and strongest partner, and set it up in order to raise funds specifically for that project or their projects. And we went on the backs of a television series called Orangutan Island, which you may or may not remember. Your viewers and listeners may have seen a decade ago. And it followed the lives of these orphaned orangutans through their rehabilitation. And it was really sort of like a reality TV with orangutans. And, you know, there was a US version, there was a UK version. We always thought the UK version was a little more intellectual. And it went for 2 seasons, but then the economy collapsed. And when the economy collapsed, so much media went with it. And Orangutan Island closed after the 2nd season. But Orangutan Outreach, I had positioned it well enough to be able to maintain itself and then continue to grow. And so with subsequent years, I was able to work with more partners and even partner up with new groups to create new centers. So to find pieces of Borneo that were not being addressed in terms of orangutan murders, for lack of a better word, to create centers. And that's actually how Gunung comes into the picture, because we partnered up with International Animal Rescue to create a new center in West Borneo. And Gunung was one of the early rescues. So that's how he comes into the picture. And we expanded into Sumatra by working with the Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program and Dr. Ian Singleton. And those, so BOSS, IR, and SOCP are really the big 3 that we've been working with for now almost 13 years. And it's really, there's many good things, many bad things over the years, but here we are, and the deforestation has slowed down a bit, although you might be able to argue because there's less to cut. Finally, the train of babies coming into the centers has lessened. But again, you could also argue that because there's fewer in the wild. But the one positive trope that I'll keep coming back to is that over the last 5 years or so, we've been able to really, and we meaning the partners, you know, Orangutan Outreach is a big funder from the outside, but these teams on the ground of mainly local people working for these fabulous organizations have been able to get a release program going that's gotten hundreds of orangutans who were rescued as infants and rehabilitated, or rescued wild and just sort of kept until they could go back into the wild. So hundreds of them have now gone back into the wild and they're reproducing. So there is some light in this otherwise tale of darkness, I like to say. So there's the long answer. What was the question again?
Yeah, it was about, you know, what it's all about. So you've given us a really good snapshot there of, you know, telling us about, and it is amazing really to think that, you know, you've felt like you've had a connection with them all your life, and
yeah,
and you know, you're working at UNICEF and in New York, and you've obviously just felt like, you know, the need to go out there. So you went out there a few times, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to do something about it, which is amazing. I think maybe a lot of people might have these dreams and these desires that, you know, I want to help, but how can I help? But you've obviously, maybe with your being experienced, being at UNICEF, you were able to use that experience. But it's really amazing to think that you've followed up on it, and 13 years later, helped thousands of orangutans.
It's crazy. I mean, there isn't a day that goes by where I don't think, oh my God, this is still happening. This is still, because it's a love and it's obsession. And yeah, I mean, if I look back at the trajectory to right now, it is, you know, I'm always self-effacing, and I always keep myself in the background. I never really, you know, we don't need this old bearded dude as the face of the organization when you have these beautiful orangutans. But yeah, every once in a while, I probably should stop and smell the roses, I guess, and just acknowledge the fact that, yeah, it's 13 years, and we've seen the life cycle now. You know, we've seen births, and we've seen them raised from infancy. And one of the best stories right now that really, you know, because again, on March 18th in 2020, you know, the world's kind of a mess, and seeking some piece of light in all of it is key, I think, to our own sanity. And we happen to have a story coming out of, again, West Borneo in the IAR Center. One of Gunung's older cousins, a female named Monty, who was one of the first rescues back in 2009. Right when we'd all shook hands and said, okay, we're going to make this center work. And I'm so proud that Orangutan Outreach has been able to help IAR see this through. But Monty, who was, this big when she was rescued, she was tiny, in this dilapidated, abandoned transit center that IAR took over and with Dr. Carmela Llanos Sanchez, and expanded and moved it onto a new site and acquired land and built it out, and turned it into this magnificent operation that, with a conservation center educating local children, phenomenal. And little Monty, over the years, over the 10-year period, grew up and went through the rehabilitation from literally day one. And of all the starts and stops and positive and negative of what's happening with an uncertain future. And by the end of her rehabilitation, she'd grown into a big orangutan, a nice, healthy female. And she had a mothering instinct. And the staff at IAR, they paired her up with a new infant who'd been brought in, and another orphaned infant. And that baby, Angun, connected with Monty and vice versa. And as soon as they were together, Monty just took Angun and put her on, and it was as if, it's miraculous. Maybe we're easily amused, but it is an amusement. This is an orangutan who'd been raised in captivity, rehabilitated by humans, was able to take a baby orangutan who was the same size as she had been when we found her, and be her surrogate mother. And they spent a year or so, a year and a half together at the rehabilitation center on an island, living semi-free, monitored, but essentially in a forest situation. And then just last month, Carmela's team took Monty with baby Angun to be released into the real forest, where they're now, they're being followed by staff to make sure they're doing all right. But so far, so good. So this is like this full circle of life that we've been able to see. And I think that's what really, with time, you start to see these things happening. 5 years ago, my conversation with you would be very different. It would be much more bleak. There wasn't an exit strategy. Numbers were still going up at the centers, and we weren't sure what's going to happen to all these brave souls that managed to survive this long. Like, where are they going to go? But now at least we have this output going. And those sorts of things make me think, wow, I've been doing this a long time. And thank God there's good people in the field doing good work and making this so, because for people who love orangutans, this is the only hope for the future.
Wow, that's amazing. Absolutely amazing to hear about Monty and the way that she's taken on, a surrogate baby and stuff. And that's the thing, like you say, that's them success stories give you that extra boost, that injection of energy to go, you know what, I'm keeping going. Of course you keep going, but
absolutely,
is that positive energy behind something? Yeah, incredible, absolutely incredible. And so what else in terms of, so when you take in, say you found like Gunung or something, you bring them in, what's the rehabilitation like? I bet some of them are in a pretty bad way.
Most of them are actually pretty bad. And like so bad that it's some of them are almost dead. Carmela at IR once brought one in who was almost mummified.
Oh, no.
And it's not necessarily because people were doing it on purpose. They just didn't know. It's just more ignorance. You have some that have had limbs cut off, machete wounds because they were cut off their dead mother, or maybe even cut out of their mother. Everything imaginable. They come in with bullet wounds. There are some that have more than 100 pellets in them. And then, these are usually the larger adult male and females, and they have a will to survive, which is mind blowing. They just, as long as they're alive, they're alive. Sometimes I wonder, why don't they all just kill themselves? Humans don't deserve to have them on Earth. It's like the Earth isn't good enough at this point. But yeah, they come in and not just so much the physical wounds, but they're obviously clearly traumatized. And with an orangutan, much like a human, the musculature in their face is so similar, where you're looking at their expressions, and those are real expressions. I don't care what anybody says. You're looking at them and they're looking at you, and you have a very good idea of their level of pleased versus displeased at whatever is in front of them, whether it's what they're eating or who they're with or you. So you have this psychological effect as well. And, again, this is an orangutan in nature would be with his or her mother for 8 years, 7, 8 years. For the first couple of years, they're on their mother. They don't let go. They have iron grips. And they're also 80 feet up in the trees. It's like a whole world that we can hardly comprehend, and they've been torn out of that, and often trafficked in very unpleasant circumstances. Sometimes they end up as pets in local villages until they die, or someone has mercy and makes a phone call to a center. Often they end up trafficked out into the smuggling networks that are controlled by billion-dollar mafias with no law enforcement, essentially. And they end up trafficked to the Middle East or into China or into Russia, where they're or even within Indonesia as prestigious pets, because it's absolutely illegal to possess one in Indonesia according to statute. You cannot touch one, harm one, it's illegal. But those who consider themselves above the law have them as pets. And this is often the governors, the bupatis, the leaders of the villages, the military commanders, the chiefs of police. This is too often the case. So this is the places they end up. But when they happen to be rescued and they bring in, first they go through a quarantine to make sure, they get health checks to make sure they didn't catch anything from the humans, because if they were in villages where there's dire poverty, chances are they came into contact with hepatitis or tuberculosis or God knows what, maybe a coronavirus. We don't know. That's a whole other conversation. So they're checked for their health. So they're kept by themselves in quarantine, and then once they pass all the tests, some don't pass the tests, and they go in a different direction, But again, there's no euthanasia, so they're always cared for. Some don't make it. Some just come in so ill, and so they've been fed a diet of Coke and rice for a year, and they don't have hair and everything imaginable. Again, sometimes you get angry, sometimes you pity. I mean, because of these situations where they're found in. I usually get angry, but over time you have to just have mercy and pity and feel bad for the people that are in these circumstances to even begin with. Again, another conversation. But the babies will come in, and let's say, like Gunung, for instance, he was pretty healthy. So he went through his quarantine, and then once they get the green light from all the vets with the same protocols, basically you would give a human, which we're learning all about now. And then they're, depending on their age or size, because some are teeny tiny. Some just need to sit on a pillow or sit on a human babysitter all day because, they're months old. If they're a little older and a little more aware and looking around and curious, they'll be put into a nursery school or baby school, because chances are there's other orangutans similar in age or size. And that becomes a cohort or a class, basically. And so they will then become friends. and it's pretty amazing. It is that cute story that you look at a photo and you just melt, and people love and people share, and it's amazing, because what these little guys and girls need is a friend. They need comfort, because basically they're used to being, and they'll sit and you'll see these photos going around of they're hugging each other. Because that's their instinct, is to hug and grasp. That, which brings us back to Monty, which is why it's so fantastic to have a baby grab onto an older female. because you've almost skipped 4 stages of a rehabilitation. But other than that, the baby goes through baby school, and as they get older and they start becoming stronger and more curious, they're learning how to build nests, they're learning how to climb and how to swing in trees or brachiate, learning what to eat, all from the human caregivers, who are 99% indigenous local Dayak women at the centers, or in Sumatra, not Dayak, but local village girls, almost exclusively female. And again, another great conversation is this is the first time these girls have been in a money economy. So it's another sociological PhD waiting to be written, I guess. But the babies will grow and develop, and as they develop, they'll move up in the ranks. And up until now, there have been so many babies at the centers that there's literally classes. You know, there's Forest School 1, Forest School 2, Forest School 3, as you know, first grade, second grade, third grade. I guess that's what we call them in the U.S. But and again, it's just like humans, except orangutans, and you know, they have good days and bad days. Some are excellently skilled, some are a little less skilled than others. Some don't want to build the nest. Some maybe build the nest 2 inches off the ground and they won't go up, you know. And eventually what happens is something kicks in, an instinct, and they become orangutans, and they climb higher, they swing further, they build a better nest. They want to stay in the nest out at night. They don't want to come back, because most often the orangutans in forest school come back at night to the center and sleep in the communal cages, which is also pretty amazing to watch when they all run and jump into the cage together. You know, it's like, and then when they come out, it's like a clown car, you know, because it's a cage this big and there's like 10 of them in there. And again, that's not their permanent housing, but it's for sleeping purposes, because they cuddle. And they'll keep developing. Again, you have some that don't develop so much. Some just don't. You know, again, it's like humans. Some of us were a little slower in some subjects, but in the perfect world, they just keep developing. And depending on the exact center, because they're all designed a little different, because some are older and have different land use issues with islands, and some have vertical space, some don't. But what happens is once they get stronger, really, once they're too big to be handled by the humans, and they bite and they grab and they don't let go, they graduate into sort of a pre-university. And they'll shift from a little forest school, which is local, if possible, onto an island. And the shows Orangutan Diary, Orangutan Island, and now Orangutan Jungle School all feature these aspects, this aspect of rehabilitation. And basically, they'll go live on islands. Sometimes they're man-made islands within a facility ground. Sometimes they're actual river islands that are protected and patrolled. Or sometimes they're whole areas of forest that have been basically acquired by these organizations, our partners on the ground, for use. And then the orangutans, as they grow more comfortable in this wider space, they get wilder and wilder, and they want to stay there. They don't want to come back. They prefer to forage for their own food instead of being just given, you know, again, the orangutans are not going to say no if you hand them a piece of fruit. They're not dumb. They're going to take it. But they realize that there's more exciting fruits up in the trees, and there's more good stuff out there, and they show each other, so they're socially learning. And once one learns or what it is, and if you can eat it, they all learn, and they all do it. And what we've seen over the years is, as these cohorts develop, you know, they're a group. And this is another interesting thing that's now being studied is, in the wild, orangutans would be separated. You know, there's mothers and young, and then the males sort of roam around, but they don't live in social groups the way chimpanzees do, or gorillas. They're isolated. You know, they're not solitary to the extreme, although they tend to be loners. But so now, coming out of these rehab programs, they're socialized in groups. And that's, we don't know are they going to stay together in the wild? Some do. Some don't. Or do the instincts kick in, and the females claim their territory, and then the males roam around, which is how it is in nature. The females dominate the territory. female has her land or her forest with her children. And when her children grow up, the daughter takes the contiguous forest out and out and out. And the males get kicked out. And they have to, and they roam around and basically impregnate females. So we're going to be seeing what happens in the wild with these newly released, newly created populations. But what happens, getting back to the rehabilitation, is once they've basically expressed absolute perfection in these island situations, and there's no need for them to come back into a center, they're given final medical tests, final evaluations, they're observed to make sure they're not sleeping on the ground, to make sure they're not having too many social issues with each other. And they're basically green lighted for a release. And with IAR and BOSS, those groups then go out, sometimes in groups as much as 12 of them or more, in these big release programs. So they'll be taken out to an area of the forest deep in the heart of Borneo, deep, far away. I mean, there's some human villages, but there's no industry. There's no one there yet extracting the trees, so to speak. And they're taken out and they're released. And BOSS now has done it with hundreds of orangutans. IAR is creeping up now with their numbers. Ironically, on two ends of the same national park. So eventually those two groups may start to meet each other. And that's it. I mean, that's a success story once they're released. And again, as I said before, they're followed. So there's teams on the ground comprised of the local indigenous people who are employed by the projects to follow the orangutans, along with people from back at the centers and veterinarians, and occasionally PhD students, to monitor them and make sure they're all right. Because some of them have trouble when they get out there. And if they do, they can always be brought back. Some of them have gotten sick, some have died, some have been bitten by snakes, things that you can't prepare for in life. But that monitoring is now going on for years. And after a year of them in the wild, they're wild. They're out there and they disappear. They all have trackers in them, so they can be followed by radio. And we're now looking into developing programs where you could send drones up to basically monitor where all the beeps are. Again, in development, and again, the terrain isn't so friendly for that sort of stuff. But that's an idea, and I have this great image of all the beeps on a grid and watching them move and speeding it up and seeing almost like this great dance of the beeps. But yeah, that's the perfect success story. I mean, so someday, knock on wood, Gunung will probably a couple more years will be in a release program. Yeah, and then again, I should say that there are those who don't get released, and that's one of the biggest concerns we have right now, both in terms of long-term care, funding, personnel, keeping people interested, because everyone loves the cute babies. I mean, again, you look at Gunung and how do you not look, right? But it's some of these bigger adults that are going to need the major funding going forward.
It's really amazing to hear like the really in-depth, the work that you guys are doing. It makes me feel even more grateful that I've been supporting you for what you said 5 years. And I'm interested to know, so like how many orangutans are in the wild, or how many were in the wild until, it kind of like the deforestation really kicked in?
It varies. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands before the industrial deforestation. Again, there was always poaching, there was always consumption at the indigenous level. Again, they're viewed just as meat by some people. It's a tough number, both in Sumatra and Borneo. The numbers we've used again, someone will be like, "Oh, he's wrong." No. But we've estimated between 35 and 40,000 in Borneo still wild. Although I'm not an expert at the demographics, and I find that I think it's lower. But again, I don't have data, so It's just my opinion. I act as if it's lower, which I think is in their best interest. In Sumatra, it's a little trickier. The estimate used to be about 6,000 wild, and then it was suddenly bumped up to about 15,000 or maybe 12,000 or so, because there was another population that hadn't been accounted apparently. But then a couple of years ago, it was decided that a certain subspecies was actually its own species. So in Sumatra, you have, most of them are above, they're all in northern Sumatra, but there's some that are separated from all the others. And it turns out, it's fascinating, their DNA is actually closer to the Bornean orangutans. So they're in Sumatra, but they share DNA with Borneans, which really takes you back to the point where it was all one landmass, Sundaland, before the waters came up and you had the separation. So that's going back, don't quote me, but I don't know, 50,000 years. I don't know. These are called Tapanuli orangutans because that's the area of Sumatra they're in. And the scary part is that there's barely enough of them. There's only, I think, maybe 800 or so, probably even lower. And they're in 3 little populations, and the authorities with their Chinese billionaires investing in it, and the oligarchs are building a dam, a hydro dam right there in the middle of their forest. And it's absolutely unnecessary. We all fought it, but the powers that be are building the dam. And it's sort of not stoppable at this point. Although with coronavirus and this shakedown of the economy, maybe it is stoppable. Maybe a silver lining of sorts. But these Tapanuli orangutans, if these 3 populations of them are cut off, they'll eventually implode. It's just a matter of mathematics of DNA collapse. So we're hoping beyond hope that we can keep them going. But it's hard, we're not pessimistic, but we're not really optimistic either. We're just, there are people playing at this that have a lot of money at stake. And little conservationists, we're the mosquitoes as far as the economy, or the economy is considered, is looking at this. But within Sumatra itself, you have all of the Sumatran orangutans up north, not the Tapanulis, and SOCP is really the go-to organization caring for them. And they've had their release programs over the years as well, and it's successful. But again, you have encroachment into the forests from all angles, and these crazy ideas to build roads through the forests. And again, this touches back to when I was at UNICEF, because my heyday was right after the tsunami hit. And this, again, the tsunami is so long ago now, but it devastated the areas of North Sumatra and Aceh region. And there had been a civil war in Indonesia at the time between the North Sumatrans and Aceh and Jakarta, basically wanting to be independent. And and the tsunami basically ended the civil war, because there was such devastation and loss of life. And as soon as the war ended, the rebels who'd been hiding out in the forests were no longer in the forests. And so without them there, the forest started to be destroyed, sometimes by those same people, sometimes just by industrial loggers, sometimes by international companies wanting the wood. And again, the same thing, it was converted into oil palm. It's a convoluted story, but long story short, that the Sumatran orangutans have really faced a tough situation. I mean, all orangutans have, but in Sumatra, there's fewer to start with. So whether it's 6,000 or 12,000, it's dire. They're critically endangered. And in Borneo, there's more of them, but it's not necessarily better because they're spread out. In the U.S., and when I'm giving a speech, I'll say, all right, well, Borneo's like Texas and Sumatra's like California. Both big spaces, but one's considerably bigger. And in Borneo, you have subspecies of Bornean orangutans that are different. I mean, they could all interbreed in theory, but they're all technically different species. And the individual populations, so while there's more in total, the individual populations are shrinking. And if it goes below 300, it'll collapse. And that's what we're dealing with. And so you start to see whole regions that they've been decimated. So you have a lot of these babies where ideally they would be taken back when they're older to the area where they came from. But that can't happen because that forest is gone. So what organizations like IR and BOSS have done is they've found new areas of forest that ancestrally had orangutans in them, but they were pushed to extinction hundreds of years ago, maybe 100 years ago. And that's where the release programs are taking place. So these are forests that are perfectly suitable for orangutans, but no longer have them, because you can't just take you can't take the rehabs and put them in with wild ones, because the fight will be over quickly, for obvious reasons. But back to the numbers. So we tend not to use exact numbers. What we do say is that the numbers are going down drastically and rapidly. And that's what needs to be stopped. We're pushing back with the released orangutans and creating these new populations, but it's still a Band-Aid relative to keeping these wild populations safe in the wild. And there's a few of them. And we, our partners work on the ground with local peoples and concession owners to protect them. But again, orangutans wander off their area, and if they come into conflict with a human, the winner is always the human. The orangutan never wins. And maybe they get a bite in, but they lose. And that human orangutan conflict is always an issue on the peripheries. And that's a tough one. You mitigate it by sending out teams to raise awareness and educate the local people. But at the end of the day, if a farmer has his little piece of land and an orangutan comes and eats some of the fruit, and they need that fruit to feed themselves and make some money, it's not going to end well. Maybe you get a phone call and then you go pick up a body. It's not pleasant. It's usually not positive, but occasionally it is positive. And it's those rare occasions that we focus on now, with the IAR rescue team, with the BOSS rescue team, going out and at least trying to save a mother with the baby. Because a mother and a baby saved together is a whole different ballgame, because then they don't have to go through rehabilitation. They're brought to the center, they're tested, they're maybe cared for by the veterinarians, and their nutrition is brought back up. And then they can be what we call translocated, which is to say taken to a safer area of forest further from people. Again, not perfect. It's like you coming here and taking me out of New York and putting me in Chicago. I'll figure my way around, but someone in Chicago may have their way with me. It's sort of the parallel is there. So long story short, we want to protect the wild orangutans in the wild while creating these new populations and caring for those who can't be released to the best of our ability. So that's sort of like the three-pronged approach.
That's interesting to hear. And I'll just mention, if anyone was listening could hear a few things in the background. I've got my own little cat in the background who's making a few little howling noises at the moment. She actually looks a little bit like an orangutan. She's got this really ginger colour. So if anyone else hears that in the background, that's what it is. It's nothing else. But yeah, that's really interesting, because something that's really inspired me over the years to get more interested in conservation and wildlife is when I started come across statistics like over the last 50 years, we've lost half of the world's animal population.
Yeah.
And I've got a few projects going on. I go give talks to students and other people, and I let them know this statistic. And it's like saying, well, does that mean in another 50 years there'll be nothing left and it'll just be us? But by that time, we probably would have destroyed ourselves as well. So, to see what you're doing, and obviously you can't do it on your own and you probably can't solve it all, but at least you're doing something amazing and you're slowing the actual, you bring an awareness to people, you're slowing it down, you're creating a space for them to go back out into. So it's really, really admirable what you're doing. And, it must be chance. Like, I've spoken to quite a few people who run charities and organizations, and often they're so in it. And you're telling me stuff. You must get bad news all the time about it, like you're saying, the billionaires coming in doing stuff, and it's always a bit of a fight against the system in place. Yeah, from us looking outside, and we can be saying, "Wow, it's amazing what you're doing," and the path you're going on. But in terms of, I'm interested to know, like, obviously you actually sound like you're a New Yorker, but I understand that you actually grew up in, is it California? And that's where you first got that love of animals?
I'm from California, but I lived in New York City for the last 20 years. And I moved up north. My wife and I finally escaped from New York, so to speak, and moved north for a little peace and tranquility. In California, we like to say California is the future. And I moved back into the past. But yeah, there's just a more awareness of the outdoor existence of nature on the West Coast. I don't know how to explain it, to be honest, but there's just something about the wide open spaces and the proximity to mountains and oceans and deserts, all within a drive, that sort of thing. But again, you have that in other parts of the world, so it's not that special. But my orangutan thing, it's difficult to explain, because it really goes back my entire life. Because most of my life I wasn't doing anything even remotely related to orangutan conservation, but always, whatever I was doing, wherever I was, whoever I was with, the orangutans always managed to touch me somehow. Whether I was flipping TV stations and there happened to be an orangutan show on, or whether I was walking down the street and looked in a window and there was a picture of an orangutan or a book about orangutan, something like that, or walk past a toy shop and there'd just be a little plush orangutan in the window. Always there. Always. And again, a lot of what I do, my own obsessive compulsive behavior, some of it has to do with the fact that I feel like, oh, wow, I kind of missed the boat 30 years ago or 20 years ago or whatnot. And so I'm trying to make up for lost time. And it's not something I recommend to people because it's basically a recipe for burnout. Especially if you're in New York City doing it. But yeah, that's the inspiration is the orangutans themselves, and that I am blessed that I know I love orangutans, that it's clear to me. There's no doubt. It's unconditional. I'm also blessed that I have a very tolerant wife who's learned to love them tremendously. But it's created this central focus. Again, I do other things when I try to have balance in life, but it's over the years it's really just rolled, and other people have gravitated towards it. And there's actually another person working with me now. For most of the time it was just me hammering away at a keyboard and an iPhone. But again, Orangutan Outreach was created in 2007, really before social media got going. 2 years in, Facebook was starting to really roll out for the general population, and there was no Instagram yet. Twitter, I think, came around 2009 or so, 2008 maybe. So it was a different world where this really was, as an organization, advocacy for orangutans, representing, like, it was a voice for the orangutans and a voice and an outlet for these projects. Now with social media, the landscape has obviously changed, because all our partners, all the groups are online. Everyone can get messaging out. So what I've really focused on is just sort of steering the brand, so to speak, not to get too business speaky, but just this idea of orangutan outreach and giving people an opportunity like you to adopt an orangutan. I mean, you can adopt from a bunch of organizations, but you've been with us, and we're grateful, and we're grateful for all of our supporters, and that's something that most of our support has come from individual donors. We're the Bernie Sanders of orangutan conservation. $17, or in our case, $10 per month to adopt an orangutan, and we track all our data. So we know all of the adoptions and who was adopted over the years, and who the popular orangutans are, and what regions people adopt from. So we follow all of our data. And it's really become a global phenomenon, and it's given people the ability to come to Orangutan Outreach and make and maybe adopt an orangutan from this center or that center or that center or all the centers to sort of have this holistic point of view. And again, like you said, yeah, there's a lot of bad news. A lot of it is just depressing with what we deal with. But there are fortunately some positive outcomes. We wish there were more, but there's increasingly more. And that's really the inspiration. I mean, for me, I get depressed a little every day. And then it seems that the rest of the world is starting to catch up. But I'm fortunate in that I can just look at a picture of an orangutan or a plush orangutan and feel some force enter me, something good, something full of light, full of life, full of love. And that's the inspiration to keep going, to keep doing it. And yeah, that's that's where we are. I wonder what's it going to be like in 13 years. What about 5 years? What about even a year from now? And this gets us back to the state of the world right now with the coronavirus. Because one of the things in Sumatra, when you go to the SOCP facility, it's basically one road and you drive down it. And as you get closer, you pass little areas where people are selling bats for consumption. They're raising bats for food. And we're thinking every time we see, we've been going for a decade now, and you drive down the road and you're like, God, no, these people don't eat the bats. You're gonna get something. The bats have viruses that we can't handle. And, we feel sort of like crazy people, we're like the crazy foreigners, or when I'm here talking with friends, I go, oh God, Rich is going to talk about the bats again. Oh, Jesus. That's what we've now seen in China with the Wuhan virus, that from the bats. So it's like, it is real. Maybe it's not from the bats in Sumatra infecting the Sumatran population, but we're part of this, and we're seeing that when the forests are destroyed and the animals are extracted, the viruses in them are extracted as well. And that's now what the rest of the world is dealing with, all of us. As we sit here, I work from home, you say you work from home, so this whole work from home thing, we're used to it. But most people are now working from home. My wife works for a company in advertising and deals with personnel, and everyone's working from home, and it's a new thing for everybody. And it's, it's this brave new world we're in, but it's very much related to deforestation and animals and conservation. And who knows, maybe it all ends tomorrow, but probably not.
No, probably not. But I do think, just talking about the coronavirus, it's definitely, obviously we're in this grip of fear. As you said, it's the 18th of March now. So we're kind of, us in the West are really, really starting to feel it. And who knows by the time this goes out, where we'll be.
Yeah.
But there's generally, I believe that things happen for a reason. A bit like when you were talking before, saying all your life, you just keep on seeing pictures of orangutans, they'd be everywhere. You turn the TV channel on, you'd walk past something in the shop. It's almost something inside of you that is pulling you along to it. And I just feel like the coronavirus can potentially help to rebalance things, rebalance the air pollution, what's happening on the ground. I know that Extinction Rebellion have been releasing footage and info about when China shut down all its factories, the difference it's made, like in certain towns now and cities there, the cloud has moved so people can see the blue sky again and the sun. So this is kind of, one of the massive positives from it all. And I'd like to think if it does go on for extended period of time, which it does seem to be, it could go on for that amount of enough time to actually change human behavior, to make us wake up and realize that our decisions that we've been making have an effect. Maybe when there was 100 million people on the planet, it didn't matter so much. But when there's 7 billion of us and it's all about take from the earth, as if we live on this planet, as if there's infinite resources, yet there's not. We're seeing that now. Like you probably haven't it where you guys, we go to the shops now, there's no toilet roll. There's no hand
Can't
sanitizer.
even go to the shops now.
No, all the pasta's gone and stuff like that in places, and we're starting to realize, well, what truly is important. It's not the latest iPhone. It's not the next new clothes. It's not even them events that you go to. It's realizing, and I think, and what I'm noticing just from it already is how nicer people are becoming. Like I'm getting, there's just this love that's coming out. I think people really feel like they're about to lose something, but in that way, that's cracking more of us open to be, show our true selves. So off the back of this and tying it into what you guys do, it can potentially, really help what's happening in Borneo and other places to slow down the rampant, deforestation of the field.
We're hoping. Again, I saw a headline this morning in Italy. Obviously, with the reduced with the quarantine, there's no industry going on. So same thing as in China. All of a sudden, the smog was gone over northern Italy. And then I read that there were fish spotted in the canals in Venice. I'm like, oh my God, never even occurred to me that there could be fish in those canals. It's like, oh. And it's like where nature can, nature will. And yeah, this is, we're watching how things roll out in Indonesia, because the pandemic will get bad in Indonesia, just because you have a situation where you have so many people claustrophobically living, especially on the island of Java. I mean, there's millions and millions of people. I mean, Jakarta's just normal times is chaos. They're even trying to move their capital into Borneo. Just another disaster in the making. But we'll see what happens as this unrolls there. I mean, it can't not. I mean, I'd love to be proven wrong, but it can't not have a massive effect on an aging population with little or no health care. I mean, kind of like the US. Bad joke. But it's probably going to get very bad in Indonesia, and how it will affect the oligarchy there, because Indonesia really is controlled by a handful of wealthy families. We'll see how things go in terms of the continued depletion of resources and what they do in terms of deforestation and mining and God knows everything else they're doing to destroy their forests. But hopefully it will have an effect to slow it down, or maybe even turn it around. It's hard to be that optimistic, because it's almost like everyone's just kind of hunkered down, and then once they get the whistle, they're gonna just spring out there with the bulldozers and make up for lost time. Again, I'm like you. I'm trying to be optimistic about it and see that there is a silver lining. I mean, I love orangutans. I prefer orangutans. They're my favorite, primate, including humans. So we'll see what happens. We don't know. I mean, we're, on a more dire note, we're hoping and praying it doesn't affect, the COVID virus doesn't affect the orangutan population specifically, because there's a damn good chance it might, or would, or could, or will. We don't know. The partner organizations are now rolling out protocols, basically shutting down the centers and keeping everybody out. Oh, sorry. Sorry. And we're worried about the staff at some of the centers, especially in Borneo, because last fall and then a few years ago, there have been catastrophic fires, which just polluted the air and left hundreds of thousands of people with respiratory illnesses and brain damage. I mean, it's everything imaginable from smoke inhalation. And these people are all highly susceptible, obviously, to a coronavirus, because just by nature of it being a respiratory situation. And if it starts affecting the local populations, it almost by definition will penetrate into the rescue centers themselves and could affect the orangutan. So we literally, we don't know. And we're on a day-to-day information sharing about what's happening. we don't, again, since we don't know, who knows? Maybe all the humans die and the orangutans take over. Maybe that should be a movie. Oh,
yeah. Well, I pray to God that they're okay, and I'm also pray to God that it doesn't affect too many humans. But I think along the way, if it can wake us up, because also I think about this as well, is that often we humans get distracted by a lot of stuff. It could be sports, it could be many things, but now we're not going to have all them things to distract ourselves. So the focus is going to be a bit more on us going inward to realize, do more self-reflection, but also we're going to have much more focus on our governments and how they are. And we'll realize, probably for the most purpose, that they're not fit for purpose. And maybe, and they haven't got a clue in some instances, and also realizing who are they actually serving? Are they serving the people and the planet and the animals, or are they serving industry and the companies? So that's going to be, Spencer, your light's going to be spot on that, because there's not going to be distractions of going out to restaurants, to catching up with friends, to going to watch sports, so it's definitely, it's an interesting time. And who knows when actually this does go out, what the world's going to look like. But I am an eternal optimist, even though I am also doing my best to, I'm thinking, like, I've got older relatives and families, and I do not want to, even though I know I'll be okay, I'm being conscious. I don't want to harm anyone else, even in the process. So I do. I pray that your orangutans are going to be safe throughout this process, and also people that are looking after them out there. So I also understand that one of you along the path for you as well. Did you spend some time living out in Barcelona and actually being in one of the zoos there? You built up a bit of a connection with one of the orangutans there.
Many years ago. After college, I went to Barcelona. So this, just to put it into 1993. So a long time ago. And I just went there to live, teach a bit of English. And, they used to have this very famous gorilla named Copito de Nieve, or Snowflake, who was the only albino gorilla in the world. And so he was famous, gorgeous gorilla. And I would go to see Copito. I had an apartment near the zoo, and so I would spend my days wandering over there, just watching. But on the way to see Snowflake, you'd walk down the path, and there was this shitty, awful, horrible stone enclosure with a big orangutan sitting in it, with the most disgruntled, sad, and angry face. And I basically just bonded with him. And I'm like, Copito gets all the attention, whatever. Copito gets plenty of attention. Everyone's going to see Copito. And this was Mo, this great cheek batter, sitting there in the most horrific cell block. I mean, basically he was sitting on a piece of concrete with two metal things, and in one of them it was like a wheel, and he rotated. It would just create this amazing, horrid sound of metal grinding on metal. And he would do it every night, like late afternoon before it was time to go in. And it was just his scream to the world. In the wild, he would have been letting out a long call to let all the other orangutans know he was there and where the females are. But in this situation, he's just stuck there, like imprisoned by humans. And I would go see him often, and he was my Ishmael. There's a book called Ishmael that you may or may not have heard of, it, about a gorilla who basically teaches a man how about the world. And Mo was sort of my Ishmael in a way, and I'll never forget him. I spent hours just staring and watching him, and sort of eye to eye. And once you've looked a non-human primate in the, I mean, you could maybe argue once you've looked an animal in the eyes, things change. But once you've looked, in my case, an orangutan, or I suppose for some a chimpanzee would do the trick. Once you really look in their eyes and they look back, and you communicate, because without words, maybe we're talking, but they're not talking, but they're saying so much. It's almost just like like they're downloading information into you, and it's phenomenal. You feel them. Yeah. And I don't want to get too kooky about it, but you just all of a sudden you comprehend their sense of being, or their being. Again, Sanskrit probably has great terminology for this. And that was many, many years ago. And I mean, he's on my wall. Where is he? Well, I have orangutans everywhere, but he's on the wall. And I think about him often, pretty much every day at some point. And, he was one of many along this path who spoke to me, not with words, obviously, but spoke to me. And he stuck with me. And everything I do is connected to somehow alleviating the situation for, obviously I can't help Mo now, but for Mo's cousins, so to speak. And all of these great cheek padders sitting in the cages in Indonesia, waiting to be let out, either to go free or to be on an island or just anything better than where they are now. And again, it's no fault of our partners. You do the best you can with a 300-pound male orangutan that wants to have sex with every female inside. Again, at the end of the day, as my friends at International Animal Rescue remind me, they are animals. It's I call them gods, but that's my own religion. But so everything is connected back to Mo. I mean, in my own narrative. And every time I see a cheek batter, I see Mo. And there's others along the way that didn't make it out of their horrible enclosures, and it's bittersweet. I'm honored and blessed to have had the experience, but I wish to God it hadn't been like that. In the same way, I wish to God we didn't have to do this. I wish the orangutans were just all safe in the forest, and we can fly there, pay a ticket to admission, and not go too close, and just see them in the wild where they belong. Because an orangutan in a cage is the most depressing thing ever. Many of the zoos do the best they can, but many are just strapped for cash, and the enclosures aren't good. But an orangutan in a cage is it's like a human in a cage. Something's not right about it. I guess, unless maybe you did something and you deserve it, I guess. Those are other issues.
Yeah, I think there's something about when we see animals, they feel so helpless, and it's certainly not their choice. They haven't done anything wrong. And when you talk about that, it reminds me of the documentary Blackfish about Tilly that's, kept up inside, like at night he's in this tiny tank. Normally each day he might swim up to 100 miles maybe or more, and all of a sudden he's in there, and SeaWorld will come out with their narrative saying they're treated well and they're in chlorinated pools, and it makes me think one of the questions I want to ask you, because I know with Tilikum they would probably maybe in the captivity they would only live a dozen, 20 years max, but in the wild they could be 70, 80, 90. And I'm wondering, what's the comparison of orangutans, ones that in captivity compared to like out in the wild?
That's a damn good question. I don't have exact data, but what I can say is one of the researchers in Sumatra who was there for enough decades saw a female live into her 60s. We know they live into their 50s. The females live longer than the males, same as humans. They live longer in the wild, but again, it's tricky because if they're in the wild, it's almost like a Zen situation. If they're in the wild, they're in the wild. We don't necessarily know unless we're following them from the birth. And that's longitudinal far into the future, because a lot of these research programs are new. We know they die, the males especially die much younger in captivity. They get what's called airsaculitis, and they have respiratory issues. And it can range, it could be, well, it's genetic, obviously, because we've seen it pass down generations. But could be related to just the ambience, the environment they're in, because they would normally be in this dense rainforest with thick, moist air. And if they're living in a dry, frozen compound in North America or in Europe, that's just not, their biology is not made for that. The diet is obviously altered in captivity. Also in the wild, they're groomed different because they're in the wild. They're not like, as they're moving, the branches are brushing their hair. So you see these orangutans sometimes in the wild who look perfectly coiffed. I mean, it's spectacular. You don't get the dreadlocks necessarily that you get in captivity because they're not moving around enough. They're sitting around. They haven't developed the full use. I mean, it's sort of like the anti-yoga, because they're not using their whole body the way they're meant to. A lot of the newer zoos and the better zoos, frankly, have vertical space and make use of poles so they can move and swing into different areas and enclosures, like in the National Zoo in Washington. The orangutans live better there than most humans, I think. They have different areas, indoor, outdoor. They can be near each other, far away from each other. They can go up and they swing over the humans into other areas. So they have a lot of space. And, if I had to be an orangutan in a zoo, that would probably be my number one choice. But in terms of their life expectancy, yeah, it's lower in captivity. I don't know if there's many studies in terms of the birth intervals. In the wild, a mother has a baby every 7 or 8 years. And the baby, it takes that long for the baby to grow up, grow independent of the mother, and move on. At which point the male conveniently arrives and she gets pregnant again. It's this great dance of nature. It's a rhythm. It's how it works. In captivity, obviously, the breeding goes on at the whim of the human caretakers, whether the zoo needs babies or whatnot. And there's programs, the species survival program manages the orangutan populations in the zoo system. There's one in Europe, there's one in North America, and all the data is shared. And so there's scientific thinking behind the genetics in the zoo, in the captive populations, to try to spread the genes out as much as possible. So there's people thinking about this issue. But yeah, the long story short is that in captivity they live shorter lives. There's some that have lived longer. There's some, not longer, but there's some females especially who have lived to their 50s. It's interesting, there's a few in North America who are the last of the wild caught Sumatrans. Again, zoos haven't had imported orangutans in decades now, but you have that last generation who are still alive and they're long lived. So that's saying something. I don't know what. There's some scientists. Dr. Graham Baines is an expert who deal with these issues. But yeah, they belong in the wild.
And also, and obviously the life is going to be reduced, but also it's just the quality of life. Like you said, when you're in Barcelona and you're connecting with that guy and you're just seeing how unhappy he is.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
And
enrichment is so, what we call enrichment, which is the providing of something to entertain their minds and keep their minds active and give them diversity and variety in their otherwise mundane life. Nature would take care of that just by existence, their lives in the wild. Again, the orangutans aren't the most active creatures. They're pretty mellow. They can sit still for long periods of time. We like to call them Buddhas or yogis. They're up there because it's so freaking hot. There's an economy of energy going on. So they move when necessary. Because any extra wasting of calories could be critically, could be problematic. So they know where the fruit patterns are, which trees to go towards, and they'll get there in the most expeditious way. And they'll sit and clear the tree and sleep a lot and repeat. so in captivity, there is this need for constant enrichment. And it's in the zoos, or at least the good zoos, the accredited zoos. That's part, they're aware of this. And there are lots of attempts made to entertain them, so to speak, to make them, to challenge them for their food. They always win the challenge, but just anything to keep them a little, shake things up a little, with the pairings, where they can go. So there's attempts, valid, effective attempts made to mitigate the otherwise boredom of existence in captivity. It's the kind of thing, like all these parents now whose kids are home from school for the next 3 months. What are they going to do to entertain these little wild humans?
Yeah.
It's going to be creative. Some will be entertained well. Some will just jack into a Netflix and that's it, and stop to eat and pee. With the orangutans, we had an iPad program for a while where we would distribute iPads, and the keepers would let the orangutans play with the touchscreens because they like it. There's a tactile, it fit, except the thumbs, their nails were a little too big to fit on the, same thing with us. If you don't cut your nails, you can't use your phone. You're like, damn. And we had it in quite a few zoos and sanctuaries. The iPads are still out there, and we got a lot of promotion about it. It was really meant to raise awareness and funding for the wild populations, ultimately, and provide a little enrichment locally. And especially in the winters when the orangutans don't go out. Because a lot of the zoos, they have good outdoor spaces. But during the cold months, they don't go out. So they're sitting, basically, it's like you sitting in your room all winter. You better be well entertained. So that was part of our reasoning behind the iPad project. And it was successful. It just sort of didn't gain enough steam. And there were always problems with the technology and the lack of Wi-Fi. And same issues as schools have, I guess. But that's something we always think about, and me especially, since Mo. Again, every time I see concrete, I think of Mo, and like sitting there. It's like a little prison yard. It goes out to walk in a circle and have a cigarette for an hour, then goes back into solitary, I guess. But, yeah.
Yeah, it's it's fascinating, isn't it? When you're talking about kids now who are going to be off for a few months, it's almost we're moving into a social experiment there as well, with how that's all going to unfold. But then, of course, there's parallels to what you're talking about. So, if someone is listening to this and going, well, you know what, I want to join and sponsor someone like Gunung or someone, how as well as how they can do it, I'm interested to know how many other people is there like me who are giving this $10 a month to support you guys.
Numbers wise, we have about 900 adoptive parents, I'd say, right now. It fluctuates around between 900 and 1,000, depending on marketing and promotions going on at the time. And it's $10 a month, although I can announce it here, we're about to raise it to $15 a month. Not for new adopters. Inflation. Okay. We're first time in 13 years we're raising the price, or $150 a year. So people who adopt for the full year, it's a little cheaper because there's lower fees and whatnot. But really, like I said before, jokingly, we're the Bernie Sanders of adoptions and orangutan conservation. That most of our support is from normal people. We get some corporate support, some grants, some really good grants. No disrespect to the grants, but a lot of our support is really just school kids who do a project and raise the $10 a month doing chores and things like that. And people like you're a perfect example. You love your orangutan and Gunung. You part of your life. And people can really just do it by just going to our website, redapes.org, and adopting an orangutan. If you go to the website, you go to the adoption page, and you'll see we have quite a few on there now. We're actually, some are going to be graduating, like Monty, now that she's been released. She's no longer adoptable. We have a few more that are going to be graduating and being released, and we'll be adding a few more just to keep it fresh. And looking ahead, we're going to be adding more adults who are going to be cared for in these sanctuary spaces, because they're the ones, as all the babies graduate and move out and go to college, get jobs, we're going to be left with mainly adults. And that's really going to be a change in focus, because people don't fall in love with the adults as much as they do with the babies. People don't share the photo of the big adult male 10,000 times on Facebook. Everyone shares the babies. Babies are cute, get that. But that's something that we really need to focus on, is this long-term care, long-term sanctuary care with adequate stimulation, adequate enrichment, adequate funding, adequate space, and I want to say more than adequate, the best we can give them. So yeah, people can just go to the website and adopt, and we're very grateful for that support. As you know, the adoptions last a year. You get updates a couple times a year. It's all done online. We don't send anything out. It's just too costly to mail things, mail paper and mail. You can order plushies and things on site, but in terms of sending it out, it's so costly. And we'd much prefer that the funds go to the projects for the orangutans themselves than to credit card companies and banks and the post office and things like that. But yeah, it's that simple. You adopt, and they're real orangutans. And for better or for worse, we've had some die. And there's nothing more sad than having to write to an adoptive parent telling them their adopted orangutan passed away. It's like, but that's part of the cycle we deal with. We don't want to be one of these large $50 million organizations that has, adoptions that are just sort of in theory. It's the idea you're adopting an orangutan, but it's not really an orangutan. Little Gunung is real,
Yeah,
better or for worse, he's real. He gets sick, he gets the flu, he has bad days, he has good days. These are real creatures that need help.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I remember being drawn to as well, is that feeling, as you say, you're the Bernie Sanders of side of things, where it is a grassroots thing, it is people on the ground, and feeling like, your money's going to go somewhere. And nothing against the other ones, like, WWF and that, which I've done before. I remember sponsoring and supporting, like, is it mountain lions and all sorts of things. But I started to do some more research and realizing that actually not that big a percentage of my money was even making its way there. There was so much administration costs. They were paying separate companies to run fundraisers for them. And then, they would, almost like 50% of it would get swallowed up in that. And that just didn't sort of sit right with me.
50% isn't even that bad. I mean, we aim for 90% at Orangutan Outreach, and we've been pretty good about it. And in fact, it actually goes up to 100%, because a lot of the times we have certain donations that cover the rest of the operations, the IT, the websites, and all this stuff. But no, there are some organizations that don't even give 10% to the actual field. Wow. It all goes to overhead and administrative fees and the fancy offices. I mean, my fancy office is, I feel like Mo. I'm like sitting here. I need my metal wheel to spin. But yeah, that's another thing. When I created Orangutan Outreach, I wanted to do it specifically so that if we were asking a child to have a bake sale to raise $10 to adopt an orangutan, I can't even imagine the audacity to not give as much of that as possible to the projects. Again, it's conservation. It's never going to be perfect, and it's this is the human world, but you got to inquire about these things. It's sad. And again, being in this now for 13 years, I've seen organizations start and stop. I've seen people come and go. And yeah, some people are in it for the right reasons. Most are, I think. Some aren't. Some get bored with it. Some just it's too depressing. But there are also people out there who are malicious, who are bad actors, and who are taking advantage of the fact that people look at a baby orangutan and think, oh, so cute, and open up the wallet. And they know that you can do that. And it breaks my heart and makes me angry as hell, but it's not, it hasn't stopped. And it's like, I don't have enough energy to like, to go crazy about it. There's too much other stuff to go crazy about. But you just hope people do their homework, do their research, and they ask the right questions. Some do, some don't.
Well, that's why I made up that I'm doing this interview with you, and we've chatted a bit for over the past few years and stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, this can give it a bit more, you know, it's nice to hear a bit more the story of it. And obviously I already see from, you know, the research that I did built up a lot of trust, but I'd love to think off the back of this that there'd be a few more donations potentially that might seep in. But if someone else is listening to this and obviously would love to donate and to sponsor and to adopt an orangutan, what else can they do, whether it's with your organization or, you know, if someone actually wants to go out and be on the field and like help, is there programs that people can get involved in to go and work in some of the rehabilitation centers?
That's tricky. The programs we work with and support are all strictly hands off. There's no cuddling. There's no one's going over there to hang out with the orangutans. You know, there's projects that you go and you're helping with the enrichment, you're helping with the construction, you're helping prepare the meals. You know, like a situation like Bosnia Omentang, our oldest partner, they got like 350 orangutans, maybe. I don't even know the exact number any day of the week, but so that's a lot of meals to prepare. Granted, it's not Michelin 5-star, you know, preparation. You know, it's not Gordon Ramsay. You know, but it's still a lot of cutting. A lot of oranges, a lot of corn, a lot of fruit, a lot of coconuts. So there are volunteer programs where people can go over and help with that sort of stuff. With Borneo Orangutan Survival Foundation, IR doesn't have volunteers now. SOCP doesn't have volunteers. And the truth is, we wish no one had volunteers because it's just not safe for the passing of not safe for the orangutans. Never mind the humans. And especially now with the coronavirus, there's no volunteering. Everything's basically on lockdown. God forbid one human cough could kill off every orangutan in a center. So that's being extra careful now. But in normal times, assuming we go back to normal times, which is an assumption, I guess. Yes, there are volunteer opportunities. And you know, we usually on our website, redapes.org/volunteer, we list the ones that we're supporting or promoting. And they're usually handled by third parties who basically do it professionally, which is a good and bad because there's a fee involved. So someone's making a profit and all the money isn't going to the orangutans. But at the same time, it's at least handled professionally and handled correctly. Because there are other things out there that I won't even mention, but where they don't have protocols, they don't have rules. And we know that humans are cuddling with the babies, and we know they're gonna cough, and we know they're gonna die. We know this. You know, it's like in Sumatra, we know there's places where humans go as tourists, and the infant mortality is basically, they all die. That's every 2 years there's a new baby. Because the babies die. That we know this, and it doesn't stop. It won't stop because of the poverty. And money talks, and you have not even rich white. You just have Westerners who go over there with a wad of cash so they can get their freaking selfie, and they cough. You know, so these are major problems. Or even in Borneo, there's situations where there's masses of tourists who go to witness the feeding. And so you have 50 people sitting around a platform, and the orangutans come and they get their bananas and they have the babies, and you have humans screaming and coughing. And again, it's slow motion train wreck. But to do it right, you go with some of the proper outlets. There's Borneo Nature Foundation is another group we support, and they actually run a research station in Sabangao Forest. Which is one of the last remaining forests of central Kalimantan that has a huge population of orangutans. and they take volunteers for scientific type things. So basically, biology undergraduate students can go over there for a period of time and help collect data, which is the coolest thing in the world. And had I had my brain out where it should have been instead of in another place, maybe I would have done that, when I was 17, 18 years old. But there are these opportunities to go out there and witness it, because I can say that having not gone into the field until my mid-30s, wow. I mean, it's when you're standing there in a forest, it's life-changing. You are just a changed person. I mean, it's not heaven. I'm not going to pretend it's perfect. There's bugs and snakes and things of that sort. But just the fact that you're in this ecosystem that we've all read about and watched David Attenborough for years and years and years and fallen in love with and said, wow, cool, amazing, and every emotion imaginable. When you're standing there in it, even if for a day or an hour, you feel it. And for a young person to have that opportunity, wow. Again, people who live in it are laughing right now, but coming from a perspective of Britain or the US or Canada, it's special. It's something we don't have. I mean, in the US, we can go down to our swamp areas, but it's just not the same. It's not going into Borneo. I mean, it's like another planet. It's brilliant. I mean, it's mind-blowing. Afterwards, you're like, holy shit. You're like, oh my, wow. Bravo to the people who are here working long-term. And you have all the love and affection for the local people, unless they're doing bad stuff. Then I have less love and affection. But just again, this is someone's world, and we'd like to preserve it for the orangutans and for the people. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds incredible, and I can imagine that we can watch so much stuff on TV, or we can see the heartfelt pictures on Instagram and stuff like that. But you're saying to be out there and to experience it, that almost really, particularly for you, would especially really embedded it within you. You having that mission. Basically, it's become a mission for you, hasn't it? A lifelong mission.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And it seems that you will continue for as long as you can.
As long as I have to.
Yeah, true. So it's been amazing talking to you. I think I could talk to you all day, but I like to ask all my guests, because this podcast is all about sharing what good people are doing, and there's absolutely no doubt what you've been doing for the past 13 years or more. But not just that, going back at your other work that you would have done at UNICEF, a lot of good work. But what advice would you give to someone who's looking to go out there and to do their own bit of good in the world?
Depends. Educate yourself. Learn what it is you're interested in. Study it. Amass as much information as you can. And again, it depends on what it is. In my case, I learned about orangutans. I learned about the politics of Indonesia, the history of Indonesia, the situation with the natural resources. And then I reached out to organizations and asked questions, lots of questions. And you try to connect with someone who's willing to be connected to. And again, that's kind of an easy one, I think, in this world because of social media. I mean, you can literally just find them on Facebook and pester them. I don't want people to pester me, but really just you have to inform yourself, become informed, and come from a place of education. All right, so you've learned what there is to learn, and now you want to figure out how you can make a difference, and that's possibly volunteering with someone or an organization already doing what it is you think you might want to do. To see, maybe you'll hate it. Make sure you're actually into it. Again, as much as I can love the experience of being in a rainforest, I couldn't live in it. I've spent far too much of my life in the northern hemisphere and in the U.S. to be able to live in the rainforest. It's kind of funny, in fact. It's like it's amazing, but at the same time, the mosquitoes and there are illnesses. There's malaria. There's dengue. There's all sorts of fun illnesses pre-coronavirus that are part of it. And so you have to be comprehensive of it. You have to understand that what comes with it, beyond the romance, or maybe part of the romance is getting malaria. It shouldn't be, but I know plenty of people that have had malaria. I haven't, thank God. But really just becoming aware, reaching out, getting to know the situation, because thinking of it almost intellectually as a problem, not as necessarily a bad thing, but just something that, all right, something that you want to help sort of not fix, because fix is putting a value on it. In the case of orangutans, what can I do to help them survive? That was basically a kind of an easy one. And then write things down, like come up with ideas of how you can make a difference. For most people, in the case of conservation of what I'm doing, the answer is donate, to be honest, because we as Westerners are only so useful unless we're veterinary specialists or ophthalmologists who can fly over and do emergency surgery on an orangutan who had her eye shot out. Unless you're that level of expertise, most of us we're cheerleaders. I mean, I'm in a way a glorified cheerleader. I'm raising funds for these projects, but I'm also sitting here in the comfort of my quarantined, sequestered existence in New York, raising funds, but cheering on the teams in the field. And again, I take as little credit as I must, because it's the people in the field. And part of this questioning when you want to pursue a goal is, how can you help the people who are on the front line? It's like right now what we're dealing with in a coronavirus. What can we do to help the nurses and physicians in the hospitals dealing with people who are ill? You can help by not buying all the masks. That's a good thing. And you just apply that logic and reasoning to whatever situation is. And again, if you want to do something to help, I think there will be a way to help. I think the universe operates like that. If you're coming at it with the right intention, and you're not there to self-aggrandize, or you're not there to make $1 million bucks. Although there are some people who make a lot of money doing this, and they shouldn't, but it's just my own value judgment. If you have this desire and will, I think the universe will present an opportunity without sounding too kooky.
No, it's not too kooky. No, that sounds incredible. And yeah, it's absolute, pleasure to sit down and to talk with you and to find out about the journey, to get much more insight into the actual organization and the incredible work you're doing. I am in awe, really, and people like you and other people that I've interviewed who have really got that, are being driven by something deep inside of them. It's bigger than them. And yeah. I think that's the thing, is saying to people who are listening to this, it's finding that deeper meaning, that deeper reason for doing something. So, and it's great for me to be able to sit down and to sit with someone.
I appreciate that. Yeah, you can listen to me blab and blab and blab.
No, it's great. No, it's been a pleasure. And what I'll do is I'll be sure to, I think you mentioned the web address. Is it
redapes.org? Here, I can give you a visual. Am I in front of the camera?
Yeah, you're in front of the camera. That's great. And
here's our plush orangutans we sell.
Amazing. I'll be sure as well to include all the links and stuff, the stuff that we share.
Perfect.
People can not only, get involved in terms of, supporting the charity, but, stuff you talked about, the volunteer links and stuff like that, but I'll include all that in it. But yeah, Rich, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thanks for your time.
And you, Rob, much appreciated. And thanks for your support for the last, 5 years. So thank you from Gunung.
So there we have it, guys. There's my interview wrapped up with Rich from Orangutan Outreach. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I do. If you feel inspired to get involved with the organization, please do. There'll be links in the show notes. And also, if you enjoy this, please share it with a friend. It helps get the message out of what Rich is doing and how we can potentially help more of these orangutans, and just have more of an awareness of what some of our actions are doing. Like, for instance, when you go and buy something in the supermarket and it's got palm oil in, maybe we'll have a bit more of a connection with what our actions are doing. So yeah, all good, guys. So anyway, until next time, have a good one.